On a cold autumn afternoon in New York, Robert Greene, a millionaire businessman known for his lavish lifestyle and natural distrust of strangers, encounters something unexpected on a busy Manhattan street corner. A black woman, dressed in rags and visibly haggard, catches his attention unexpectedly. Moved by an impulse he doesn't understand, Robert invites her to his house so she can take a shower and eat. However, what begins as an act of charity soon takes a surprising turn, revealing secrets from the past that will make Robert question his entire life. Now let's move on to the introduction and context of the story, with around 800 words. I'll start by introducing Robert, the woman he meets, and the beginning of this unusual encounter. Robert Greene was a man who practically had the world at his feet. At 38 years old and with a fortune built over 2 decades, he was the classic figure of the New York millionaire, confident, reserved, and according to some, even arrogant. He lived in a luxurious apartment overlooking Central Park and occupied his time with exclusive meetings, charity events, and dinners with business people and influential figures. Robert had grown up in a simple family, but with a determination that bordered on obsession, he dedicated himself to his work and achieved success that few could dream of. However, his fortune had not brought him complete happiness. Robert kept his distance from others, always finding his condition a target of envy or interest. It was on a gray autumn day that he saw her for the first time. He was leaving a meeting at an elegant restaurant in Manhattan when he noticed a hunched figure sitting in a corner of the street, close to the subway station. It was a black woman, looking between 50 and 60 years old, wearing a worn coat and with her hair tied up sloppily. His eyes had a depth and sadness that contrasted with the hustle and bustle of the city around him. Robert hesitated, but for some reason he didn't understand. He couldn't ignore her. His hand was already in his pocket, ready to pull out a $100 bill and hand it to the woman, when he realized that she wasn't asking for a handout. She held a cup of cold coffee and watched the street with a distant expression. Something about that image made him stop. He felt an inexplicable curiosity and an impulse to help. And then, before he could reason, the words slipped out. "Would you like to take a shower?" he asked, somewhat embarrassed by his own question. The woman looked at him in surprise, not knowing if she was hearing correctly. His voice was hoarse but firm when he replied, "I accept." He took her to the car, maintaining an uncomfortable silence, not sure why he was doing that. On the way, his thoughts oscillated between distrust and growing curiosity. Who could she be? And why did I agree to take her home? He asked himself, but it was too late to turn back. When they arrived at his luxurious apartment, the woman seemed even more disconcerted than he was. Robert showed her the bathroom and offered towels and toiletries, watching her warily. While she was in the shower, he prepared something to eat, feeling strangely anxious as if something big was about to happen. When she came out of the bathroom, she was transformed, clean, with her hair still wet, wearing a simple outfit that he had laid out. They sat in the living room for a silent meal, but soon he broke the silence, asking her name. "My name is Lucia, but few people call me that," she replied with a slight smile. As they talked, Robert realized that Lucia was not an ordinary person. She spoke with a serenity and depth that disconcerted him. Little by little, he began to open up, talking about his childhood and how he worked his way out of poverty. On impulse, he mentioned something he hadn't told anyone. His mother had been a black woman, but, out of shame and prejudice, he had never recognized this part of his origin, rejecting everything that reminded him of his roots. Lucia's eyes shone with an expression that Robert couldn't decipher. "You know, Robert, sometimes the past comes back to us one way or another," she said. Those words, said simply, touched something deep in Robert. He felt an inexplicable uneasiness, a sense that there was more to this woman than he realized. As the conversation progressed, Lucia began to talk about hard life on the streets, about losses and secrets, revealing pieces of a story that seemed mysteriously connected to her own. Just as Robert was about to ask something more, an important revelation was about to happen, something he had no idea about, but that would forever change the course of his life. Robert's apartment was a reflection of his lifestyle. Minimalist furniture, modern artwork, and a breathtaking view of Central Park. The environment emanated luxury and power, but also coldness and emptiness, as if something essential was missing there. Every detail was meticulously thought out to impress, but the owner himself rarely seemed to pay attention to his surroundings. Lucia, on the other hand, seemed out of place in that environment. His eyes examined the apartment with curiosity, as if each object there had a secret to be discovered. Robert watched her movements with growing interest, trying to understand what it was about this woman that attracted him so much. As the conversation progressed, Lucia revealed parts of her story. She had come from a small town in the southern United States, where she had grown up in a humble working-class community. She spoke about the discrimination she had faced since she was young and how, even though she was one of the most intelligent in her class, she never had the opportunity to study the way she wanted. His life had been a succession of difficulties, losses, and, finally, the helplessness of the streets. Robert listened intently, touched in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time, he began to question his own worldview. He had spent his life believing that his success was the result of his hard work, but upon listening to Lucia, he realized that luck had also played a huge role. She was a woman with a sharp intelligence, a deep look at life, and a wisdom he rarely found in his social circles. "You know, Robert," said Lucia at one point, looking into his eyes with intensity, "sometimes wealth is not what we own, but what we are able to give to others." These words reverberated in his mind. He felt bewildered and at the same time instigated. He had always seen homeless people as part of a distant problem, but now, listening to Lucia, everything seemed different. He wondered how many other stories like hers went unnoticed every day. On the other hand, Lucia also seemed to be watching him curiously. She noticed the effort he made to show indifference, the way he spoke cautiously, measuring each word. But Lucia realized that behind that facade, there was a man still searching for something, a restless soul who had never found peace, despite his success and wealth. "You know, Robert," she said at one point, "I think you and I have more in common than it seems." He laughed dismissively, but inside he felt disconcerted. How could he, a successful millionaire, have anything in common with a woman who lived on the streets? But the sense of connection he felt was undeniable, and the more she talked, the more he wanted to hear. Meanwhile, Lucia explored her past in a frank conversation, but without complete revelations. She mentioned episodes from her youth, her love of reading, and even some hazy memories about a distant family who, according to her, had lost contact. Her face showed pain and longing at each mention, as if those pieces of memory were part of an ancient story that she was still trying to piece together. Lucia's story seemed to have a mysterious gap, something Robert noticed, but didn't want to press. As they talked, he felt an inexplicable connection, as if she were a figure he had known for a long time but couldn't remember from where. At the end of that night, when she was about to leave, Robert, without knowing what drove him, asked her to stay a little longer. Lucia smiled, accepting the silent invitation. He didn't know, but that decision would open doors to revelations and secrets that he could never imagine. In the days that followed, Robert began to meet Lucia with unexpected frequency. The initial plan was to let her use her bathroom, eat something, and leave. But spontaneously, he invited her to stay a little longer. Their conversations became a secret routine, a kind of informal therapy that neither of them dared to discuss with anyone. Robert's life, once controlled and predictable, began to change little by little. He, who normally followed a rigid schedule, started to get distracted in meetings and meetings, thinking about his conversations with Lucia. On one of those afternoons, he took courage and suggested something he would never have thought of before, offering her a small room in the apartment so that she would have a fixed place to sleep. Lucia hesitated. She was a proud woman, and despite her situation, the idea of depending on someone made her uncomfortable. But winter was coming, and New York wasn't kind to homeless people during this time. Finally, she accepted the room, on the condition that she would help with the housework as a thank you. Robert agreed, surprised at himself and at this new coexistence that he himself did not yet understand. With Lucia's arrival at their home, something began to change in the dynamics between the two. At the same time that she was grateful for having a shelter, she maintained an emotional distance, a kind of barrier that he felt but could not break. And even though he avoided it, Robert couldn't help but notice that Lucia seemed to be hiding something from her past. Some nights he heard her crying softly, and other times he noticed her looking at objects in the apartment for a long time, as if they were distant memories. One night after one of these situations, Robert couldn't resist and asked, "Lucia, I'm sorry for the intrusion, but is there anything you want to tell me?" She smiled, but there was a deep sadness in her eyes. "I believe we all have something we would like to forget, Robert, and I, more than anyone, know that the past is like a shadow. No matter how far we run, he always finds us." Those words echoed in his mind. That sentence seemed filled with a pain that Robert couldn't fully understand, but that somehow touched him deeply. He wanted to ask more, to insist, but the expression on Lucia's face made it clear that she wasn't ready to talk. The weeks passed, and their routine began to acquire a strange balance. Lucia was attentive and discreet, keeping herself busy with simple tasks, such as organizing the house and preparing meals, which she did with surprising skill. Robert, upon arriving home after exhausting days of work, felt that the apartment stopped being just a cold place and became something similar to a home. However, the tranquility began to crumble when Robert realized that, even without wanting to, he was beginning to become attached to Lucia's presence. He, who had always avoided close relationships for fear of losing control, now found himself involved in an unusual friendship that made him question values he had always had. Who was that woman really? What had led her to such a difficult situation? He couldn't help but think there was something familiar about her presence, as if she were a link to a past he preferred to ignore. One rainy afternoon, while organizing one of the drawers, Robert found something that left him perplexed: an old photograph of a woman who looked very similar to Lucia. In the image, she was next to a younger man and a child who Robert recognized immediately. It was him, still a boy around 6 years old. Feeling confused, he approached Lucia, who was sitting silently in the room, with a lost look. "This photograph. Lucia, what does it mean?" he asked, his voice shaking. She sighed deeply with a look of sadness and resignation. The time had come for a revelation she feared to make. Calmly, Lucia told the story that would forever change Robert's view of his life and origins. The revelation that she was his biological mother, forced away when he was still small, shocked Robert in an unimaginable way. The truth was that her father, at the time, had removed her under the pretext that a black woman was not suitable to raise a child who would have a promising future. Lucia had been forced to leave her own son's life, losing not only her love, but also all the security she knew. With no alternatives, she had survived on the streets, carrying with her the weight of her past and the pain of a brutal separation. Robert's reaction was a mix of anger, sadness, and bewilderment. Everything he had believed about his past, his family, and even himself was now in tatters. The strong and determined figure he had built over the years was no longer enough to hide the scars of that past. The revelation that Lucia was his biological mother shook Robert deeply. He spent days in a state of shock, remembering scenes from his childhood and questioning his own identity. The truths that had sustained his life now seemed fragile, and his relationship with Lucia transformed, oscillating between feelings of guilt, pain, and a desire for rapprochement. Lucia, in turn, was cautious. The pain of so many years without her son didn't disappear with the revelation, and she wasn't sure if she would be able to rebuild a relationship. She had already lost a lot, and she feared that closeness would end up bringing more suffering. However, there was a subplot that still remained hidden, and that could change the course of this story in an unexpected way. A few weeks after the revelation, as Robert tried to process the situation, a new question arose. He began to investigate his mother's past, feeling that there were parts of the story she had not yet told him. He hired a private investigator to understand what really happened in his childhood. He wanted to know more about the relationship between Lucia and her father and why she had disappeared from his life. The discoveries were shocking. The investigator revealed that in the years since she disappeared, Lucia had tried to reconnect with Robert several times, but was continually rejected by his paternal family. She had suffered threats and been manipulated, being forced to give up any attempt at contact. Robert felt a growing anger towards his father, who, even after his death, still caused pain in his life. As the layers of this story were unraveled, Robert began to question his own actions. He, who had always been inflexible and judgmental, now realized that he had inherited some rigid and prejudiced attitudes from his father. This was a moment of transformation. He knew that to move forward he would have to face not only the ghosts of his past, but also his own limitations. Meanwhile, Lucia tried to adapt to this new reality, where her son finally knew the truth. However, she faced an internal battle. The love she felt for Robert was as great as her fear of being rejected again. She wanted to rebuild the relationship, but knew it would take time and patience. Little by little, however, their coexistence became less tense, and a new type of bond began to form. At the same time, Robert was also facing the consequences in his professional life. His obsession with uncovering Lucia's past had made him neglect his business, and one of the partners began to act suspiciously, trying to undermine his position. This parallel conflict increased the tension and pressure in his life, making him question how much he truly trusted the people around him. It was during a night of tension that Lucia made the decision to finally open up about everything that had happened. She spoke candidly about the love she felt for him, the pain she carried, and the frustrated attempts at rapprochement. Robert listened in silence, feeling each word like an opening wound and at the same time like a balm for the resentment he felt. For the first time in years he cried, allowing himself to feel all the vulnerability he had always suppressed. This moment of truth brought a new layer to their relationship, but not without a price. Now, both would need to face the shadows that the past had cast over their lives and decide whether they would have the strength to rebuild something new. The proximity between them was still fragile, and each new discovery brought more doubts and complexity. But despite this, both began to glimpse the possibility of a new chance, not only to reconcile, but also to rediscover who they really were. Over time, Robert and Lucia began to develop a routine that mixed closeness and caution. Both knew that their relationship was transforming, but they also felt that there were barriers that were difficult to overcome. Although he wanted to open up completely to his mother, Robert still carried a certain emotional resistance, the result of years of strict teaching and his father's influence. The decisive change came when Robert discovered, through an old family document, shocking information that his investigator had missed. In a worn folder, hidden among the inheritance papers left by his father, he found a birth certificate issued decades ago, a record of a half-sibling he had never known existed. The certificate had Lucia's name as the mother, but the father's name was left blank. Robert, already intrigued, confronted Lucia with the document. Her reaction was intense. Her face scrunched up in pain, and she hesitated before finally deciding to reveal the truth. Lucia explained that even before Robert was born, she had had another son. In her youth, when she was still very young and without resources, she had been forced to give him up for adoption due to pressure from her own family. At the time, poverty and prejudice had made it impossible for her to raise her son on her own. With tears in her eyes, Lucia told how since then, her life had been marked by loss and desperate attempts to get back on her feet. This lost son was, for her, a scar that had never truly healed. She had never found out where he was taken, and now, by revealing this secret to Robert, she was reliving all the pain of the past. For Robert, it was like a second revelation, a blow that hit him not only by revealing more about his mother, but by making him question his own family and the way they had treated Lucia over the years. Determined to discover the whereabouts of his missing brother, Robert launched himself on a tireless search, using all the resources he had to investigate the fate of his lost brother. Each advance brought a new wave of anxiety, but it also brought him even closer to his mother, who accompanied him in this process, fearful and hopeful. After weeks of searching, they finally found a concrete clue. Robert's brother, who now went by the name Christopher, lived in a distant city and was unaware of his origin. He was adopted by a humble family and led a simple but happy life, without any idea that he had a biological mother and a millionaire brother. Robert decided to go to him, taking Lucia with him. The tension was palpable. Upon meeting Christopher, Robert and Lucia found themselves faced with a simple man, with physical features that now seemed familiar. The connection between them was evident, but the shock of meeting an unknown family was also immense for Christopher. After a long silence, he agreed to hear the story that Lucia and Robert had to tell. Lucia spoke about the pain of losing him, the attempts to find him again, and the tortuous path that life had forced her to take. Christopher, visibly moved, listened with patience and empathy, but also with a certain reserve. For him, this whole story was new and difficult to process, and the memories of his adoptive family were still fresh in his mind. However, he accepted the chance to learn more about his origins and build a relationship with his biological family. This unexpected family reunion was an emotional turning point that deeply affected everyone. Robert, accustomed to controlling his emotions, realized that, for the first time, he was dealing with a scenario he could not predict. This encounter transformed him, helping him to realize the importance of human connections and to value something he had always ignored: the affection and love of family. Lucia, in turn, found not only a son, but also a piece of herself that had been lost many years ago. Christopher's discovery and the family's reunion brought new meaning to their lives. Robert realized that the fortune and status he had built over the years could never replace the feeling of having a complete family. From that point on, his priority became rebuilding his relationship with Lucia and welcoming Christopher, who was beginning to accept the impact of that discovery. After reuniting with Christopher, Robert and Lucia realized that their lives had changed forever. Although Christopher was open to building a relationship, he maintained a certain distance, seeking to gradually understand this new reality. He would need time to adapt to the idea of a new family, especially one so complex and full of emotional wounds. Robert, now more aware of the impact of the revelation on everyone involved, began to reflect on the direction he wanted to take his life. The past he had always tried to avoid confronting was now present in his everyday life, and in a strange way it filled him with a new sense of purpose. He felt an intense desire to make amends for the mistakes his own family had committed with Lucia, and consequently, with him and his brother. At first he proposed a cautious approach to Christopher, respecting his time and offering financial and emotional support so that he could visit New York and eventually explore professional opportunities there. Christopher, however, politely declined any financial assistance. He explained that he wanted to get closer to Robert and Lucia, but he did not want to be seen as someone who was there out of interest. This stance made Robert respect him even more, and the relationship between the two began to be built in an honest and genuine way, based on mutual trust. Meanwhile, Lucia experienced moments of internal conflict. She was still afraid of losing her children again, especially with the differences in lifestyle and emotional wounds from the past still present. Yet as she watched the two men talk, she felt a genuine joy she hadn't felt in decades. Their presence in her life made her feel whole again. At the same time, this family rapprochement generated reactions of surprise and shock in Robert's social and professional circles. His partners, who had been suspicious of his erratic behavior since he met Lucia, questioned his leadership of the company. Rumors began to circulate about the company's stability, and one of the partners began a maneuver to take control, using Robert's meetings with Lucia and Christopher as an argument to suggest that he was losing focus. Feeling threatened, Robert needed to act quickly. He decided to face the challenges in his professional life with the same determination with which he was dealing with family challenges. In a tense meeting with partners, he made it clear that although he was reconnecting with his family, he would not abandon his commitments at the company. The demonstration of strength and resilience impressed everyone and warded off any attempted coup. However, the episode made him realize that despite everything, he still had difficulty sharing his feelings and fully trusting the people around him. The situation worsened when news about his reunion with his mother and brother was leaked to the media, something that caused a frenzy among journalists and tabloids. The story of the millionaire who rediscovered his humble roots spread quickly. Paparazzi began following Robert, Lucia, and Christopher, and the pressure of public exposure hit them hard. Christopher, accustomed to a reserved life, felt the strongest impact and began to question whether he was ready to face that world. This episode brought a new crisis, and Robert had to assure him and Lucia that he would do everything to protect their privacy and keep them safe from unwanted attention. Over time, the three realized that this exposure, although uncomfortable, was also an opportunity to show who they really were and to establish an even more solid bond. Lucia, who previously felt afraid, began to support Robert and Christopher in their moments of doubt, helping them find strength and face the challenges that public life imposed. Faced with these consequences, Robert realized that he needed to radically change his approach to life. That new journey, although painful, had made him more human, more empathetic. He began to understand that the people around him were more than resources or business opportunities, and he began to value each relationship, each experience in a new way. Thus, the bond between the three grew stronger, with Lucia becoming the central figure who united them and helped them deal with the consequences of their choices. Together, they formed an unlikely but genuine alliance, capable of facing the reactions of the outside world and continuing the process of healing and reconciliation they so desired. As the weeks passed, Robert, Lucia, and Christopher began to find new stability in their lives, gradually building a more solid and mature relationship. But although the tension with the press and business challenges had eased, Robert's path of personal transformation was still in progress. He realized that in order to continue growing, he would need to overcome his own fears, reevaluate the choices he had made, and finally, deal with the unresolved issues that still tied him to the past. Lucia played a crucial role in this phase. Now that she was with her children, she could offer them the love and support she hadn't had the chance to give before. In her calm but firm way, she taught Robert and Christopher the importance of expressing their feelings, something they had both neglected. Lucia became an emotional bridge between them, encouraging the two to build a sibling relationship based on mutual understanding and respect. Robert, who until then had been immersed in his career, began to value the time he spent with his mother and brother, discovering a type of fulfillment that money or success had never provided him. He realized that his whole life he had been searching for recognition and power to feel safe. But in fact, what he craved most was a genuine connection with the people around him. In this process, Robert also began to explore activities outside the corporate environment. She started dedicating time to social projects, aimed at helping people in vulnerable situations, as was the case with Lucia before they met again. One of the projects he founded was an institution to support homeless people to get back on their feet, offering health care, housing, and job opportunities. This project was inspired by Lucia's own story, and he made sure that she actively participated in the creation of the organization so that her voice and personal experience could be the essence of the initiative. Christopher also began to get involved in his brother's projects. He, who initially seemed distant and reserved, now realized that family contact could be something valuable. Although he was still dealing with the shock of having discovered his origins, Lucia's affection and determination helped him gradually open up. He learned to see Robert not as a figure of power, but as a brother who, like him, was looking for a home. This understanding changed the dynamic between them, causing Christopher to gradually accept Robert's invitation to work at his company, but on a more social project focused on impact on the community. This new trajectory brought them both a feeling of renewal. Robert began to give up his isolated lifestyle and began to invest in a simpler and more authentic way of living, where people took priority over business. He transformed himself into a more accessible and empathetic leader, applying the values he was learning in his personal life to business decisions. At one of the charity events organized by his new institution, Robert took the stage to talk about the project, but, in a moving gesture, he invited Lucia to come up beside him and share her life story with the audience. It was a moment of great emotion, where Lucia told how she had overcome the difficulties of the streets and found her children again, receiving a standing ovation from everyone present. Robert felt deeply proud of his mother, and at that moment he realized that this journey was not only about personal overcoming, but also about a reunion with his roots. The relationship between the three, now strengthened, has become a constant source of learning and growth. Each, when facing their own challenges and imperfections, found a renewed force to move on. The reconciliation journey brought to Robert and Christopher the understanding that the past did not need to define their lives, but that lessons and errors could build something new and positive. This process of overcoming and growth brought a sense of belonging and union that none of the three had known before. At the end of each day, Robert knew that the presence of Lucia and Christopher not only rescued him from a life of solitude, but also brought purpose and love, feelings he had always sought, but had never known where to find. As Robert, Lucia, and Christopher continued to strengthen family ties, life followed with a new pace and a renewed purpose. However, a new challenge was about to manifest itself, testing the relationship between them in a definitive way. During a routine audit in his company, Robert discovered a significant financial irregularity. Someone inside the organization had diverted large amounts of money using an elaborate and almost imperceptible scheme. The discovery of the scheme made Robert confront the partner who months earlier had tried to take control of the company. He confronted the partner directly, but when he was pressured, man implied that he could cause a new crisis in his personal life, claiming to have compromising information about Lucia and Christopher. Furious and at the same time fearful of losing his family's newly managed confidence, Robert tried to act with caution. This situation brought a new wave of tension to the trio. Robert initially decided not to tell Lucia or Christopher anything, wanting to spare the mother and brother of the company's problems. He thought that, as a family leader, he should solve everything on his own. However, this choice isolated it, causing a distance that Lucia soon noticed. Asking him about what was bothering him, Robert tried to dodge, but she knew something serious was happening. One night, Lucia called him to a sincere conversation. She reminded Robert that, as a family, they should face any obstacle together, and that she and Christopher were ready to support him. The words of Lucia, said with serenity and firmness, played Robert deeply. He realized that, despite everything they had gone together, it was still costing him to trust and depend on other people, including the people he loved the most. With a heavy heart, he finally decided to share the situation. In revealing the problems in the company, Robert felt a sense of relief but also fear. Christopher, although initially surprised, offered support and suggested some strategies that could protect the company and prevent Lucia's name from being involved. This gesture made Robert realize that his brother was not just a newcomer, but someone he could trust genuinely. Lucia, with her wisdom, offered a reassuring perspective, encouraging Robert not to be overwhelmed by fear and moving on with confidence. Determined to face the problem together, the three started working as a team. Christopher, with his fresh look at the company, suggested revisions on audit systems, and Robert began preparing a containment plan if the partner tried to harm him publicly. Lucia, always present with her moral support, reminded them that regardless of what she did, they had each other. Tension increased when the partner, realizing Robert's movement, threatened to expose counterfeit documents that would put Lucia's integrity in doubt, trying to portray her as an opportunist. This threat hit Robert deeply, and for the first time he felt how much his mother's presence meant to him. His anger and determination have grown. This time he would not allow anyone to try to destroy what he had just built. A true family. Preparing himself for the definitive confrontation, Robert joined all the evidence of the deviation scheme and sought support from the company's advisors. He knew that this moment would be decisive and would need to protect his family and business at the same time. With the counselors by his side and with renewed confidence, he was ready to face the unfair partner, restoring the integrity of both the company and his own life. The day arrived when Robert would confront the unfair partner and would solve once and for all the future of his company and his relationship with his family. With all the evidence of the diversion of money in hand and the support of the company's advisors, Robert knew he was prepared to expose the scheme. But the partner, predicting the outcome, would not be easily overcome and tried a last card, threatening to expose manipulated information that implied that Lucia would have reappeared in Robert's life only for interest. This threat, which in the past might have shaken Robert, has now had an opposite effect. He stood up before the partner and declared with a firmness he had never shown, "You can try to destroy my business, my name, and my reputation, but I wouldn't touch my family. I know who my mother is, and her presence in my life is something money can buy." Surprised by Robert's stance, the partner tried to attack, but the counselors, convinced by the presentation of the tests, decided to support him. The unfair partner's plan collapsed, and he was deprived of his position in the company. Robert, in a quick decision, has temporarily assumed his job, ensuring that the company's financial system be completely audited to prevent future fraud. This was the kind of responsibility and commitment that he could not imagine being able to assume before going through this journey of self-discovery and family reconciliation. But that was not the only confrontation waiting for Robert that day. After ending the issue with the partner, he decided to face something even deeper: the past himself. In a symbolic gesture, he called a meeting with the company's leading investors to announce significant changes in their policies and purposes. Upon opening the meeting, he told a simplified version of his story, assuming the mistake he and his family had made by rejecting the humble origins and distance himself from the truth. Robert spoke about the importance of transparency, social responsibility, and support for vulnerable communities, values he was incorporating in all operations and required partners and investors. His honest and vulnerable stance surprised everyone, and he received massive support to implement the proposed changes. For the first time, Robert felt he didn't need to pretend to be someone who wasn't. He could finally be authentic, true to the values he had rediscovered alongside Lucia and Christopher. At the end of the day, exhausted but relieved, Robert returned home, where Lucia and Christopher were waiting for him. By telling what had happened, he could finally feel free. Lucia hugged him and said to him with a quiet smile, "I'm proud of you, my son. Not for what you have, but for whom you have become." Robert felt the words of Lucia as a balm, healing ancient wounds he carried without realizing it. With Christopher by his side and Lucia smiling with approval, he realized that his life had completely transformed. That night, the three laughed, talked, and recalled moments of their individual and family stories. The feeling of peace was something Robert had never thought that one day he would experience. In the months following that decisive confrontation, the life of Robert, Lucia, and Christopher took a way that none of them had imagined before. Now, with the company operating under a new philosophy and a clear purpose of social responsibility, Robert began to divide his time between corporate activities and voluntary work at the foundation that he and Lucia had created together. They used this foundation to support vulnerable people, especially those who, like Lucia, faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives. The relationship between the three was getting stronger and stronger. Robert and Christopher, who at first were almost strange, now worked side by side, dividing responsibilities and supporting each other. Robert discovered in Christopher not only a brother, but also a friend and counselor that he had never knew he needed. Christopher in turn came to see in Robert not the distant millionaire, but an older brother who, despite the differences, helped him grow and find his place in that new world. For Lucia, living with her children brought her a peace she believed to have lost forever. Seeing his children doing well and seeing Robert embracing his roots and connecting with his humble origin was a realization that brought him deep joy. Over time, Lucia was respected not only as a mother, but as a central figure in social initiatives that inspired and turned lives into New York. Robert, in revisiting his relationship with the past, found a connection with the childhood that he had always avoided. He made a point of visiting places where he had grown, rediscovering parts of his story that he once preferred to forget. In one of these visits, he took Lucia and Christopher to meet the small house where he had spent his early years with his mother. There, sitting on the sidewalk, the three talked about life, losses, and the surprising turns of fate. The new Robert, now more human and conscious, understood that the true fortune was in the relationships he had built and in the redemption he had achieved alongside his mother and brother. He finally realized that his family's love and support had the power to fill the void he had always tried to hide with wealth and status. Months later, Robert, Lucia, and Christopher were gathered again, this time celebrating the success of the foundation. Looking around, Robert saw not only a crowd of people benefiting from the project, but also something much deeper, the realization of a dream that he didn't even know, to create a legacy of positive impact and true connection. While the event took place, Lucia gave an exciting speech, inviting others to reflect on the power of reconciliation and solidarity. And that's where Robert understood. Sometimes we need to face our greatest fears to finally find peace. Did you like this story of family transformation and reconciliation? If this journey has touched you and you want more stories full of emotion, learning, and overcoming, subscribe now to our channel. Here you will find inspiring stories, realistic tales, and life lessons that will make you see the world in a new way. Like, share it with your friends, and subscribe. Join us not to lose any of the next chapters of this exciting series of stories.